keeping in mind your pessimistic tone, I'll carry it forward a little bit too, and try and point out to some of the problems. So the way I have few talking points written down, and I'll try and go through them as briefly as possible. Uh, the topic, of course, is access to the internet, right to information, and there were four suggested discussion points that were circulated, and I'll quickly run through them. First one being internet access is access to an essential public utility service. Now, I think that requires a little bit of unpacking. Let's look at other things. Let's look at, for instance, water. We know that those living in slums often end up paying more for water than those living in the gated communities right next door. Our record with other essential public utility services have not been that great. And if you want to see how the government is actually working on this, just have a look at the cyber cafe regulations which are notified last April, and which, for instance, throw out the entire idea of privacy in cyber cafes. So in the morning we had Arna Roy talking about how from STD booths these have become internet booths, but on the other hand, that's not quite such a smooth flow, because now by law, unlike in STD booths where you can just walk in without production of any kind of identification, etc., make a phone call just by dropping 1 rupee or just by using the phone. Now every single internet cafe owner has to take a photograph of you on the spot by law if you want to be able to use the internet. And if the internet cafe owner does not do that, she can go to jail for that. Okay, because she can be held liable for whatever wrongs that you commit. That's a problem. Second, access to internet is access to information and empowerment. Well, sure, there are a number of studies, PhD theses, etc., equating information with empowerment. Whether it's the link between female education and autonomy, or the link drawn between censorship and the downfall of Indira Gandhi's lack of re-election 1977, right? But we have to think about the possibility that information sometimes empowers those who are already empowered. It is not always democratizing. It might end up giving greater voice to those who already have a greater voice. And this we can see in two ways. If you're looking at data, for instance, and there's a lot of thought about open government data these days, we have to reflect upon the fact that it's often, and when we're thinking about how we can use this to eradicate poverty or any such noble thoughts, we have to think about the fact that the poor are often the subjects of data. The data is about them, and because of what Michael Gerstein calls the data divide, they have less ability to make use of that data, whether it's in form of data literacy, in form of just understanding what the data means, or whether it's in terms of access to policymakers and to the corridors of power where you can lobby with this data. They have less access to that as well. So at multiple levels, they have less access and they have less ability to use that data. So just because the data is freely available doesn't mean that comes necessarily with the ability to use that data. And the more powerful almost always have more ability to make use of that data, right? If you're looking at something like Twitter, which lots of folks see as very democratizing, right? The majority of the people who have a large voice there are real-world celebrities. Everything from pop stars like Justin Bieber, who most here in this hall wouldn't have heard about, to folks like Barka Dutt, etc. Real-world celebrities get a huge following on Twitter and hence exert more power, more influence in Twitter. Okay, it's hardly democratizing that way. There are lots of individuals who have very few followers who keep tweeting out to the world in tweets that no one reads. Okay, and if you go through this interesting thing called tweet stats, okay, you'll see how many folks are have posted less than 10 tweets altogether on Twitter, and this is a service that we are seeing approaching multiple hundreds of millions of users, right? And looking at 2 billion users in a couple of years, or what I remember. So, and the point I'd raised earlier in the day about government focusing on social media, right? It's a very positive thing. It's actually trying to get feedback, but the feedback will inevitably be from people who already have access to the internet, are already part of the elite of India, and hence the government must look, while looking at social media as a strategy, it must look beyond that as well. Must look on ways to incentivize conversations with those who are generally left out of these conversations. The third point was developing accessible internet environment infrastructure is a creation of public/community assets. That's a very noble thought, I believe, and quite frankly, that's the way I'd like to look upon it. But reality tells me that things are otherwise. Internet infrastructure is in fact private property, and let's just look at Reliance, right? Reliance owns Flag, which is one of the largest providers of international bandwidth to India, and actually one of the largest providers of bandwidth internationally. Okay. Reliance owns ISPs which bring connectivity to your house and to your phones. Reliance owns the content that is streamed over these internet connections. Okay, and what we end up seeing is instead of a marketplace of ideas, which operates as a free market, we instead see a marketplace that's tending towards monopolies. Okay, and media regulation of that sort is in a sense a requirement where when every single part of the information value chain, as it were, is owned by corporations who don't fall under Article 19(1)(a), etc. Corporations don't owe you such duties. Your relationship with them is regulated by laws of property and by contracts, okay, not by the Constitution of India, and that is a stark reality. And the one model which I think is slightly different is that of Wikipedia, okay, which is an example of public or community asset run by a non-profit trust, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to see the internet becoming a giant Wikipedia. Okay, that's not where. But my point is that we have to look upon the fact that the internet is not really a public space. For instance, even Frank LaRue, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, used that metaphor of the public square, right, of the town square where anyone is free to go and express their speech. But the internet isn't. The internet is, in fact, lots of private parks where people go and try and express their speech. And lastly, and very quickly, I'll wrap up. Appropriate content and services plan with accessibility and affordability determine translation of right to internet into actual outcome framework. Now, this itself is debatable, but I guess it'll come up in the next session whether you can think in terms of a right to the internet, because I think it actually makes more sense rather than thinking in terms of right to internet as what all other kinds of rights does the internet enable. Very crucially, everything from the right to trade to the right to speech to etc., etc., right? Now, so the internet being an enabler to those is something that's essential, and it's a separate question which can't be addressed right now as to whether the rights framework is being overburdened. I personally believe that it is. There are those who disagree, but so the right to the internet, I think, is a bit more of rhetorical flourish than something that's actionable. And since you're thinking in terms of actual outcome frameworks, I think we should be looking in terms of how, for instance, we can guarantee accessibility for persons with disabilities. How, for instance, despite there being a very high amount of mobile penetration in India, still there are all kinds of regulations that don't, for instance, mobile penetration in rural areas still is greatly lacking. Okay, and urban penetration is making up for that in the statistics. Now, we have to be looking at things like Indian languages. Looking at the example I cited earlier, Wikipedia. Indian languages on Wikipedia are grossly underrepresented. One of the problems is actually just simply getting that firstly, people who are equally at ease in English are those participating on Wikipedia. So a lot more Indians contribute to Wikipedia in English than in Indian languages, right? I, for instance, speak different Indian languages, but I can't write effectively in any of them. Okay. And secondly, I think one common solution to looking at Indian languages and accessibility for persons with disabilities would be to move away from just text inputs and text outputs to things such as and furthering speech-to-text technologies and text-to-speech technologies, etc. There is, of course, the National Data Sharing and Accessibility Policy, which was referred to earlier today as the Open Data Policy in India. Now, that would, for instance, get certain kinds of content out, which affordable, etc. But the policy betrays a lack of larger vision. It doesn't situate itself, for instance, within the right to information framework. It doesn't situate itself as a way of enabling Section 4 of the RTI Act and enabling those kinds of things. It leaves it. The RTI Act, for instance, doesn't give you a choice, give public authorities a choice as to whether to respond to something or not. They have to, right? On the other hand, this policy says that it's completely up to every department to decide what information to put up and in what form, whether as open access, closed access, restricted access, to put it. So it's the very inverse of the RTI Act in fact. And I think while we're thinking about content, while we're thinking about accessibility, these
Come back.
kinds